It's Halloween. Everyone's entitled to one good scare.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Entitled Scares, a podcast where we talk about all things related to horror. I'm your host, Z, and today we are going to be tackling the newest movie from Justin Tipping, Him, starring Marlon Wayans and Tyriq Withers. And just like Halloween 1978, this episode is going to be overall just a review and a breakdown of the entire plot of the movie, and just giving my final thoughts of what worked in the movie and what could have been added to maybe add a little bit more context to the overall theme of the movie. I'm really excited to record this. I rewatched the movie last night and I took a lot of notes. And so I hope this episode is informative. I hope we have fun while you listen. And just sit back and relax and we'll jump right into it. So to start with my overall review of the movie, I want to start with just talking about production. And so I'm not too familiar with the director Justin Tipping's work. And I do want to emphasize that he is the director of the movie because I think a lot of people went into the movie thinking that this was a Jordan Peele directed movie. They were expecting Jordan Peele vibes and Jordan Peele messaging. However, like I said, I do want to emphasize that this is a Justin Tipping directed movie. And Jordan Peele, his Monkey Paw production company, is the one that produced the film. And so Justin Tipping is the director and he is also a writer of the film. And like I said, I'm not too familiar with his work, but when I was looking into him, I saw that he directed a movie called Kicks that came out in 2016. And he also directed some episodes of The Shy and Dear White People. And then the co-writers of the movie are Skip Bronke and Zach Akers. And then, like I said previously before, Justin Peele's Monkey Paw Productions are the producers of the movie. Moving on to the cast of the film, the main characters we focus on is Cameron Cade and Isaiah White. Cameron Cade is played by Tyriq Withers, and he is a new actor. He has been in some things before, but he is a pretty new actor when it comes to the big screen. It looks like he's a Jacksonville, Florida native. He went to Florida State University and graduated with 2 degrees in business and marketing in 2022. And he is also a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Regarding his other filmography or film works, it looks like he was in an episode of Atlanta called Rich Wigga, Poor Wigga. And I haven't seen that episode in a long time. I do remember when that came out and I do remember watching it, but I can't really remember what Tyreek's acting was like in it. But from what I've seen, it looks like his acting was very, very good in that, and people did enjoy watching him in that episode. And then I see he was also in an episode of The Game. And then this year, as well as him, he also starred in I Know What You Did Last Summer, which came out in July 2025. And so moving on to Isaiah White, which is our second primary character, he is played by none other than Marlon Wayans. And I was very intrigued and very excited to see him in this role because the only serious role I've ever seen him in was Requiem for a Dream. And if you haven't watched that, I'd highly recommend that you watch that movie. 10 out of 10 acting, 10 out of 10 cinematography. Very dark vibes though. So most people say that it's a one-time watch, but I do highly suggest watching that if you want to see another movie with Marlon being a little bit more serious. But you guys, of course, would also know him from the Wayans Brothers show, and then the Scary Movie franchise, the movie White Chicks, Little Man, A Haunted House, Norbit, and much, much more. And so some other characters that we focus on that, or supportive characters that we have in the film is Cameron's manager, Tom. And I didn't recognize him, but he is played by Tom Heidecker, and he was in Us, and he played the character Tex, who was the husband in the couple that was friends to the main couple that we see in the movie. So I thought that was pretty cool because I kind of like when production companies or directors reuse actors such as Ryan Coogler and Michael B. Jordan, or I believe Spike Lee and Denzel Washington. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then we have Marco, who is the sports doctor in the film. We have a henchman or right-hand man named Malik, and he also has another significant role in the film outside of being the henchman. We have Isaiah's girlfriend or wife. I believe it's his wife, Julia White, obviously because she has his last name. I'm sorry, I'm confusing myself. Julia White is the actress that plays Elsie, but I still do believe that that is Isaiah's wife in the film. But it's played by Julia White, who I believe was in Uncut Gems. And I really honestly only knew her for dating Kanye and for the meme, the Uncut Gems meme. But I will say she did a pretty darn good job in the movie, and I really liked her vibe. And I'm not going to say that anything that I saw of her outside of the film, it didn't make me go in with any bias. Like, I didn't feel like I embraced her role or her acting in the movie without open arms. And so I really did like that. I really did like the way she was portrayed in the film. And I liked the personality that she brought to the character and the vibes that she brought to the film. So then we also see Marjorie, who is I guess you can say the president of the Savior / Isaiah White's fan club. And then we have Cameron's girlfriend. I don't believe they put a name to her. I want to say in the credits and in whatever casting I saw, I only saw her listed as girlfriend. But she is apparently played by Tierra Whack, and I didn't realize that. And when I did research that, I thought maybe I just don't know what Tierra Whack looks like, but I genuinely didn't realize that that was her. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then we also have Cameron's brother Drew, his mother, and then I thought this character was his friend, but in the credits, apparently this is his cousin. And the actor's name is Akeem Hayes, but apparently he is a rapper named Guapdad 4000 or Guap. And I'm not familiar with any of his music. However, he did have a song that's on the movie soundtrack called Swim. And I'm gonna get into the scene that I believe has the beat drop where the song starts, but it's a very, very good song and I thoroughly enjoyed it, especially the use of it in the movie. And so now that we've talked about some of the background with the movie, I want to jump directly into this plot because when I first watched the movie, I'm not going to say I was confused, but I wasn't sure what I was going into. And so it's like every time I was paranoid when I first watched it, I was cringing at the horror aspects and I think the best way I can describe it is just paranoia. Like, that's the main vibe throughout the whole movie to me. Even with the second watch, I was still paranoid. I felt like I needed to look over my own shoulder, and it was pretty interesting. I really do like the vibe of this film. But to start off, so the movie opens up with we see a young Cam with his family, his mom, his dad, and his brother watching a Saviors football game. And um the family is really excited. You can tell this is a very big game. As a person who went to a popular college with a popular football team, I definitely understand. So I really felt those vibes while watching this, especially the way that they were reacting to everything. Um, and so we see Isaiah White's character, he makes a touchdown. And when he makes this touchdown, a candle on a table nearby blows out, or I believe it's 3 candles set up, and 2 of the 3 blow out whenever this touchdown is made. And so that's kind of that was the first sign that I saw when I first watched this movie of something being a little bit off with the Saviors. For one, the name of the football team being Saviors was crazy to me. Not crazy, like, as in, like, it's absurd or, like, it's inappropriate or anything, but I just thought after watching the full movie and seeing what the background of it was and what was going on behind the scenes, I thought that it was ironic that the team's name was the Saviors. And so after that candle blows out, we see on the TV screen that Isaiah has actually broken his leg, and this is the first scene of body horror within the film, and I think that that's the main scary part to me, because I cringe really hard at body horror, especially when it comes to, like, stabbings, anything breaking, stuff like that. And so it's a very graphic scene. And so this is one of the first things that we see. His leg is literally just like dangling there. You can see the bones sticking out. And it's kind of a glimpse type scene, but we still kind of linger on it for maybe like 3 or 4 seconds. And so you really get a good look at it. And while we see that Isaiah is hurt, you can see young Cam, kind of turn away because obviously it's a very disturbing scene to see live on television, especially for a child. But his dad comes over to him and he basically kind of makes him look at the screen, not in a forceful way, like he's pretty gentle about it, but he's basically telling him, this is how you make a man. Like, you have to get hurt when you want to go after the things that you want. So this is where we get introduced to the movie's theme of no guts, no glory. And this is constantly said throughout the film. And it also kind of plays into the sacrifice theme that I'll get into a little bit later. But yes, you see his dad kind of pushing him and telling him, you may get injured. This is what it takes in order to get the things that you want. And this is also what, like I said before, this is what makes a man, which of course isn't true. But seems to be the message that his dad is trying to push to him. So after Isaiah gets hurt, we go into a montage of Isaiah making a comeback. We hear some audio of news broadcasting saying how he made a speedy recovery. He's won 8 Super Bowls. And we see a scene of him at the end of the montage. We see a scene of him sitting alone with a Super Bowl trophy, and he's sitting alone in the locker room, and it's pretty dark, but in the room right in front of him, you can see the door open to the dressing room. Not locker room, because I see where the locker room is, because that's where like the showers are. But there's the other like main locker room where all the players and their items are placed. And they're celebrating. The mascot's out there dancing, pouring liquor on the floor, and Isaiah's just there cuddled up with this trophy. And this also introduces us to Isaiah's mindset that we're going to dive deeper into as we go throughout the movie. But we see the separation of how the players are focused more on the win. But Isaiah, he's also focused on the win, but we'll find out that there's a deeper passion for the game that the other players don't have, which is why he's sitting alone, cuddling the trophy, hugging it, and stuff like that. After we go through the intro of Isaiah, we jump cut to a montage of Cam. Again, we have news broadcaster audio talking about how Cam is a star player, how they've been looking at him, how he's expected to be the next great football star, and all this other good stuff. And so after the montage for Cam, we go into a interview scene, and it's just a scene where Cam is being interviewed. He's in a room with his mom, his brother, and his girlfriend, and we find out that his father has passed away. So, he's doing the football in, honor of his dad. And of course, as I said in the opening scene, we found out his dad's passion for the game. But during the interview scene, the main thing that stood out to me was when it opens up, we get a in of an altar that's set up for the Savior's football team. And it seems to be the same place that the candles were that blew out in the opening scene whenever Isaiah made a touchdown. And so this altar, I think this also just shows the idolization of the football team, of course. But again, we're going to see later in the movie at the very end, all of this is going to come around full circle. And this altar of the team will make sense. Because obviously we know about sports fanatics, crazy fans and stuff like that. Even outside of sports, we can think about, the Barbs for Nicki Minaj or like the Beehive for Beyonce. We know about crazy fans, but I've never seen fans make like an altar for their sports teams. And of course, I'm not the biggest sports person. I really don't know diddly squat about sports at all. But as I said, I've never seen that. That really caught my eye whenever I saw that scene. And so I definitely had to note that. And so after the interview scene, we jump to a scene of Isaiah throwing the practicing on a football field. And it appears to either be his college football field or maybe his high school football field. I know he's coming out of college, so it's most likely the college one. But he has a coach that's there, and the coach is leaving, tells him to lock up behind him whenever he leaves. Cam agrees. He still continues to work out. I had to ask my boyfriend this because, as I said, I do not know anything about sports, football, anything. And so apparently what Cam is doing is working on his accuracy, and he's throwing the ball at the goalpost to do so. And so at one point, when he does throw the ball, we go to it and it's spinning on the ground. It's just spiraling on the ground, standing upright. And this scene reminds me of the shoe scene in Nope. If you haven't seen that, another movie that I 10 out of 10 recommend, beautiful movie. I believe that one should be directed by Jordan Peele. But as I said, the cinematography is great. The messaging is beautiful. Just another highly recommended movie that I think anyone should watch, even if you don't like horror movies. But it definitely, that football scene with it standing up reminded me of the shoe scene and like the miracle aspect. Because I believe that was one of the themes in Nope, was a bad miracle and things like that. But anyways, moving forward, so we see Cam walking to the ball and he definitely looks confused. And so he leans down to pick it up. And when he comes back up, we see a figure behind him. And it's a figure that looks like he's in old school football gear, at least helmet wise, and his face is fully covered. We don't see who it is. And then his body has, I don't want to call it armor, but it's like, it almost looks like old school football gear, but I really just don't know. If anything, I know that the helmet definitely looked like some old like football helmet from like the early years of football. But then there was also horns on it. So definitely some demonic activity going on here. And so this figure ends up hitting Cam. And so when Cam gets hit, of course, Cam ends up getting a head injury. And I want to say whenever Cam gets hit, we jump into the title, like the title screen comes up with him showing. And so we move forward to a scene of Cam in the doctor's office. And, we hear the doctor saying how he has a traumatic brain injury and how he probably shouldn't be playing. So, an interesting thing that my boyfriend brought up whenever we watched this the other day, the doctor was telling the mom and Cam that he shouldn't play. And as his doctor, he recommends or she recommends that he not play. And so Cam turns to her and says, but as a fan. Now, when I first heard this, I didn't think too much of it. I did think it was weird because obviously, why would a doctor say that? But my boyfriend pointed out that maybe the doctor. Okay, this is gonna sound confusing now because I'm trying to figure out a way to explain it because we're not to the end of the movie yet. But basically, we were assuming that maybe the doctor was in on the other behind the scenes things going on that we're gonna discuss later in the movie. Because what doctor is going to tell their patient, as a doctor, I want to say you need to sit down so you don't, kill yourself or anything at a young age or get, permanent brain damage at such a young age. But as a fan, you need to go out there and, put belt to butt. You need BTA. You need to go do something. Like no doctor is saying that. And so I just and so we thought that maybe the doctor was in on all the behind the scenes stuff that was going on to manipulate Cam to getting to the position that he was by the end of the film. And so as I said, that all makes sense. And if I remember, I will definitely come back to that by the time we make it to the end of the review of the film. And so once Cam goes out of the doctor's office and, ask the doctor as a fan, what would she advise? They jump cut to him being at a combine to prepare for the football draft. And so he walks in, he covers his head because obviously he has staples on the side of his head now since he had that traumatic injury. And so he goes back to his bedroom, not his bedroom, his dressing room. And his mom is there, his manager Tom is there, girlfriend and brother, and his friend slash cousin is also there. And so Cam is getting a haircut by his brother. And this scene honestly was making me cringe so hard in the theater because obviously Cam has these staples in his head. And so when his brother Drew was cutting his hair, he looked like he was inching ever so closer to the staples. When I tell you my shoulders were hunched the whole time, I really couldn't, I could barely watch the scene. But during the scene, we see Cam kind of zone out. We hear his people in the background asking, is he ready? Is this the responsible thing to do for him to play with the head injury? We see his phone notifications going off with news reports, people texting him, people trying to hype him up, people on his ear and his face, and he's just kind of zoning all that out. And Cam snaps out of his little dissociation because his brother ends up going over his staples, which of course makes him bleed a little bit. And so, Cam jumps up. He tells them like, hey, I'm fine. Like everyone just chill out. Let me do what I do. And I'm fine. I can do this. And so after this, we see Cam standing in the hallway. We see a couple other football players run past him to go participate in the combine. He's not, of course, because he is injured. But during this scene was very weird to me because I really can't interpret what this exactly means, but Cam hears a goat noise in the background. And so he turns, he starts walking down this dark hallway, and eventually he comes upon this person, or it looks just like a figure at first, but the person ends up standing up, and it's this kind of short and stout fan who's covered in red and white paint, and he's just kind of looking and kind of smiling, like in a way where kind of like in a starstruck. He's looking at him very in like a starstruck manner, and he holds out a marker for before he holds out the marker, actually, he starts moving towards Cam, but it's like this weird glitchy movement that he does. It's just a weird scene. And so once he ends up getting close to Cam, he holds out a marker for him to give him an autograph. Cam gives it to him, and then he makes the goat noise again, and then we jump cut to Cam and his girlfriend, his brother, and his cousin being at a party hosted by the cousin, I believe. And so at this party, Tom, Cam's manager, ends up calling him and informs him that he has the opportunity to go train with Isaiah for 1 week and so that he could possibly get drafted. And so during this phone call, I realized that Tom asks him, he's like, this is a big opportunity. Like, what are you going to say, man? I need to answer now. What would your parents say? And Cam didn't really answer when he said that. And so I don't know if that was the first sign of Cam kind of being not manipulated, but kind of being, turned from good boy goes bad, like starting that process. Or if it was just excitement and he just, ignored it. Because, not everything in a movie is a message, or not everything in a movie is some like hidden thing. So it could be nothing. But I did think that was interesting because he didn't answer. But he did end up, yelling because his friends and stuff come in and it's like, what are you on the phone for? And he's just like, we're going to the league. So obviously he agrees to go train with Isaiah. And so upon his arrival, we see him driving through a desert area. And as he's getting closer to Isaiah's house, he drives past not a campsite, but it almost looks like a little, kind of like a campsite, but I don't really see any tents anywhere, but just like a little site with a bunch of the Savior's fans / Isaiah's fans. And a fan ends up coming up. Her name is Marjorie. And she comes up to the car and she says, we don't want you. And so this is another thing that's not going to make a lot of sense until we get to the end of the movie. But I was thinking, and my boyfriend was also thinking, with her saying, we don't want you, she might be sensing that Cam isn't the right fit or would mess up the process that everyone is trying to set up to take place at the end of the film. And so maybe that's why she was saying that and why she was so against Cam being there and just was just so disgusted with his presence of trying to replace Isaiah's position as QB. And also to give context to that, so Isaiah, his contract is supposedly going to be up by the end of that season. And so that's why there's talks of Cam being the next upcoming star for the Saviors and basically replacing Isaiah's spot. And so, like, that's why I was saying that maybe Marjorie wasn't wanting him there because not only is she a fan of Isaiah's, but because she's supportive of this process and this transition that everyone is gearing up for the end of the movie. And so also during this arrival scene to Isaiah's home, we see two beautiful wide shots of the desert scenery. And his home is very, very weird. It looks kind of like a bunker in a way because when you arrive, there's a big cul-de-sac driveway, and then there's a football field off to the right side in the distance a little bit. And then the entryway looks like a football tunnel, actually, but it also kind of looks like you're going into a bunker. Like if you walked in the doors, there'll be an elevator that takes you down somewhere. But on the inside, it looks very cold, looks kind of museum-ish, very dark, a lot of stone, a lot of large pictures, artwork, and stuff like that. And so we finally get to meet Isaiah face to face with Cam, and Isaiah's welcoming him with open arms, saying, treat this place like your home. And so Isaiah, while they're in this room where he's making animal hides. And so during this scene, Isaiah has this interesting, I don't want to call it a monologue, but this brief story where he talks about the history of football and the history of quarterbacks. And he asks Cam, do you know why QBs exist? And so he starts saying that, if I remember correctly, there was a group of Native Americans who were playing the game and they started playing some white football players. And so during the game, I believe the white players were tussling the Native American players. And so the Native Americans ended up coming back with a bunch of crazy moves, and they had basically perfected the game of football. And so because of this, Isaiah was saying that boys were getting hurt on the field and were dang near dying because of the violence, because both teams were trying to wreck each other and were trying to be on top. And so he goes on to say that the president had to make the forward pass illegal. And he said, now they're mascots. And so he said, I said all that to say, nigga don't be no mascot. I thought, I don't know. I still can't necessarily understand what the story is. Maybe I'm probably going to have to go back and understand and look into the context of the football, the history of the football and the Native Americans, and that is in fact true. Because like I said, I'm not a sports person, so I don't know much about the history of all that. So I'm not sure if any of that's true. But if it is, I would love to see the history and maybe get a breakdown of what that specific scene means. But it did make me chuckle both times when I watched it. So I definitely had to note it. But if any of you have any interpretations, if you want to comment it or DM it to me, please let me know and I would love to hear it. But this is where we start the first chapter. And so there's chapters throughout the movie. And so day one is chapter one, and that chapter is entitled Fun. And when we see the title screen for day one come on the screen, we also get a beat drop of Lemonade by Gucci Man or Gucci Mane. Sorry, excuse me. Didn't mean to say that so proper. Whenever this beat dropped in the theaters, when I tell you I was vibing so hard. Even when I was watching it the second time around, I was vibing so hard. I don't know. I don't know what it was because obviously I've heard the song before, but it was something about the beat drop that just really it was tea for me. I don't know. And so at this point, we see Cam and Isaiah in a training facility. It looks like it's probably still on Isaiah's property, and it's basically just a football field. It's definitely giving Nike commercial vibes. Same vibes like the trailer, because when I was watching the Him trailer, it definitely gave Nike commercial to me. And you see him and Isaiah bonding with each other. They're making a handshake. They're training. They're working out, doing all this brotherly stuff. And so after this little montage of them working out and doing all this football training stuff, he is introduced to Marco, who's the sports doctor on site, and he tells Cam clothes off so he can do a physical. And so Cam strips completely naked, and during this physical, Isaiah's walking around him, talking to him, and so Cam asks him, um how did he come back to the game after breaking his leg? And so Isaiah says, I damn near killed myself, and takes a little bit of a beat and then says, with rehab. Um, and he explains that, as a black quarterback, you have to be great just to be good. And Cam was saying how, family is his motivation for football and was his motivation for working so hard in football. And Isaiah's telling him, family will only take you so far, and you have to find some type of external motivation to transcend the game. And so I think this is also another kind of an Easter egg as to what the extra motivations are to Isaiah bringing Cam to his home and to this training camp. Especially when he says, I damn near killed myself, with a brief pause, with rehab. It's like, so did you kill yourself with rehab or was there something else going on? I need you to elaborate just a little bit, Mr. White. But yeah, we kind of see that there's some external or extra motivations going on here that may not be the best for Cam. And so this is one of the first kind of funny moments in the movie because Marco ends up telling Cam, like, hey, put some clothes on, because mind you, he's completely naked, butt naked right now after he got the physical. And so once all that's done, Marco's like, put some clothes on. You're making me uncomfortable. And Isaiah was like, yeah, you need to put some clothes on. Like, take care of that. And so Cam is obviously confused and was just like, okay, like I'll put some clothes on, whatever. And so we move on, and this is where we're introduced to Isaiah's wife, Elsie, who appears to sell sex toys. And so we see her filming content for said toy. And I love her dialogue. I'm not going to repeat some of the stuff she says because it's a little bit too vulgar for me, but it's just so funny because I don't know. I just didn't expect that type of dialogue or humor throughout the film. Even with Marlon Wayans being a part of it, I still didn't expect that. And so, Elsie is doing this content stuff, introduces herself to Cam, invites him to the home, tells him to feel welcomed, and feel comfortable. And she actually ends up giving him the sex toy that she's promoting. And it's funny because he's obviously staring at it confused, and she was like, "Stick it up your butthole, Cam." And it was just like the delivery of her lines are just, she does a great job delivering them, and I can definitely believe that she's a social media football wife. I definitely believe that from her. And so then after this, we see Cam getting an ice bath and Isaiah is getting a blood transfusion. And Cam is, of course, asking him, what's that for? And Isaiah is basically just like, this is just a little pick me up, make sure my blood is, fresh, make sure I'm, at my full potential. he asks Cam if you want to hit this, and Cam is just like, "Nah, I'm good. I don't want no blood." And so after Isaiah leaves, he tells Cam, "I'm gonna go watch some footage," which he says this a lot throughout the movie. He always says, "I'm gonna go look at some footage. I'm gonna go look at some footage." And so after Isaiah leaves, Marco ends up giving Cam an injection randomly from a syringe and just tells him it's for the pain. And as he's walking out after giving the injection, you can hear Marco saying, "Many Asian ones will consider this blood holy." And again, just another Easter egg, just another kind of a hint as to what is going on, to lead us to the climax of the film. And so after Marco leaves, the lights go off, and then, we're engulfed in blue lighting. Cam is there by himself. It's very quiet. And he eventually slips down into the water. And at this scene, you think something's going to come out and maybe force him to stay under the water. But in fact, it's a cut scene, and not a cut scene, but it jumps to a scene of Malik, Isaiah's right-hand man, throwing water onto Cam and waking him up in the morning time. And so this also brings us to day 2, which is titled Poise, or chapter 2, Poise. And I believe when this title screen comes up, this is where we get the beat drop for Guap Dad 4000 song Swim that I was talking about earlier. Another really good beat drop that makes you do the nasty face or the ugly face, because it really just, I don't know, the vibe, it just gave Nike commercial to me, and it was just such a vibe to me. I just really liked it. And so him and Isaiah are running in the desert as we see the title screen come up and the beat drops. And as they're running, we see Cam stop. He's obviously tired and wore out. And so he ends up throwing up and he passes out. And he doesn't seem to be fully passed out because his eyes are open and he's breathing heavy, but he obviously, fell down, and is laying flat on his back. But we don't see Isaiah there with him. And so during this time when he's laying down, he has a hallucination of a mascot covered in streamers. I wanna say it's called stencil, if I'm not mistaken, but he's covered in a bunch of it. I just call them streamers, that makes the most sense to me, but it's really, another colorful, bright scene because you have the contrast of these red and silver streamers with this tan desert, and it's just really bright and just kind of a really pretty scene almost. And we see that the mascot is also carrying the same weapon that was used to hurt Cam, but this isn't the figure that we see in that scene though, whenever Cam got hurt. And so the mascot ends up walking over to Cam while dragging this weapon, and we see the mascot bring the weapon up, he slams it down onto Cam, but we don't see Cam get hit. This is all happening off screen. And then the hallucination stops, and we see Isaiah there with Cam asking him, does he need help? And if he's okay. And once Isaiah helps him, then we jump to them being back at the facility. And you can see Cam and Isaiah talking about, recovery and just repairing your body after being exhausted and stuff like that. And so during this is another interesting scene because you have, especially knowing what we're about to go into in this specific chapter in Poise, because Isaiah asks Cam, what if you can avoid getting injured? And he said, would you rather have the ability to never get tired or never get injured? And Cam says he doesn't want to get injured because he says, think about all the greats that we've lost because they got injured. And so he goes on to Isaiah asks Cam, what if you can't avoid getting injured? But we don't see Cam answer. And so after, this whole talking sequence happens, we see a bunch of football players come in, and these are free agents. And so Cam is asking Isaiah, who are these guys? And, Isaiah says they're just free agents who have nothing to lose, and they're there to train with Cam and Isaiah. And so Isaiah ends up getting up to kind of not introduce himself, but to go say hey to the free agents that are walking in. And so Marco comes over, gives him another injection, and he tells Cam in his ear, I told you you'd thank me later. It's going to be a long week. And so it's just like, what's going on here at this point? Because at this point in the film, we don't really know what's going on. Of course, there's like a couple weird things being seen, but we don't truly know like what's the motivation behind all of this other than football and getting Cam in the draft and in the league. And so when Marco says this, it immediately made my paranoia jump up because what's about to happen? What are you warning me for? And so the boys start running a 2-minute drill, and we see Isaiah ask the free agents for a volunteer. And during this time, a free agent named Said, he immediately volunteers and moves to go stand in front of a football ejector, which is the thing that has the two spinning wheels that you put the football in and eject so you can work on catching the ball or whatever the case may be. And so, well, actually, so they run the 2-minute drill for a little bit normally at first. I believe if I'm not mistaken. And then afterward, after a while, then Isaiah asks for a volunteer, which is when Said goes to stand in front of the ejector. And so after Said takes his place, Cam is still throwing the ball. And whenever he would be too slow, Said would get hit in the face with a football. And so Cam is obviously disturbed by this, but Isaiah keeps telling them to run the drill. He tells Malik, who's controlling the ejector, to turn the speed up. And during the scene, we also see Marlon's face flash with the old school football helmet on, kind of like the figure that attacked Cam on the football field previously. But it's just a brief flash, like it's literally 1 second and it cuts away really quick. Um, and so on the last hit, the last time Seth gets hit in the face, Malik gets a bunch of blood on him, or just blood on the little side of his face. And so he takes his glasses off real slowly and is just looking real blankly. His eyes are kind of cockeyed, and he's kind of just standing there. He looks dissociated at that point. Um, and so Cam argues with the other players and the other free agents, but while he's getting on to the others, Isaiah gets on him and says that every mistake falls on him, and he's like yelling at him and really getting on to him and saying, like you can't yell at them because every little thing that you do controls the outcome of people getting hurt, controls the outcome of you guys losing or getting a victory, and so you need to be considering that. And so after, Isaiah goes on this rant with Cam, we see the volunteer Said get up from obviously injured, nose is broken, tooth missing, one eye shut, he's all bloody. Um and he tells Cam that he was honored, and him and the fellas kind of laugh and chuckle for a little bit. And then Isaiah kind of looks at him and, asks him why he's laughing. So Said kind of shuts down for a moment. Um and then you see all of them kind of break and, move away and go on about their day. And so, after everyone leaves, we see that Cam is, dripping a little bit from his staple wound. And so we go to a scene of Marco replacing those staples, which is another kind of cringeworthy, slightly bodily horror type scene. And after he gets his staples replaced, Cam goes to a hyperbolic chamber. And before Isaiah closes the door to put Cam in the chamber, Isaiah tells him, the saying, God, family, football. Well, for me, it's football, family, God. And after he said that, he closed the door and, kind of left Cam by himself. And again, like I've been saying, this is just another surface level hint as to what else is actually going on here, not only in Isaiah's home, but within the football industry in general. And so while Cam is in the hyperbolic chamber, he's obviously starting to get a little bit paranoid, and he looks like he can't get out of there. And we hear a voicemail of his mom playing over this scene as he's freaking out. And he gets a brief vision of an old school football player in the room with him. But after this, we jump immediately to chapter 3, which is titled Leadership. And I want to correct myself. This is actually I want to say this is the title page, the title screen that drops WAP Dad 4000 song. But I do want to say it's the running one that I mentioned previously, but just in case, I want to mention it here too, just in case I'm incorrect. Um, they're running drills again. They're back in this training facility and they're being physical now. And so there's other players along with Cam. And so Cam ends up getting tackled. And we see an x-ray of Cam's skull during this scene. And you can see the skull cracking underneath the staples. And so after Cam gets tackled, Marlon goes into this monologue and it's a very... Marlon I really appreciate comedic actors in serious film because I feel like they do a very good job at taking it there and they do a very good job at exaggerating emotion and really pulling from within whatever emotion they're supposed to be portraying, whether that's anger, passion, grief, paranoia, whatever. And so during this scene, I really like the delivery of this line where he says, he's like, "This isn't a game, man. This is everything." And the way he's like, you can just hear like that he yearns for the game. He's passionate about the game. He lives for this. Like he breathes for this game. And this is also where we hear him, like you hear in the trailer where he's asking Cam, what are you willing to sacrifice? And Cam screams back, everything. And then we see Isaiah kind of, let Cam go, step back a little bit from him, and he says, "So show me." And so after this, we see Cam kind of powering up and, he's getting ready to run a play. And we see another player running towards him. And instead of, moving away or whatever he's supposed to do, Cam, cocks his head back and slams his head into this other player. And it goes, as soon as they make contact, the scene goes into X-ray vision, and we just see this other player's brain just rattling. And we see this other player, well, actually, at first, I want to say the scene is set up to where we think it's actually Cam who falls down to the ground, but it's actually the other player who ran into him that falls down and is basically seizing on the ground at this point. So Cam is talking mess. He's saying stuff like, "Come get your dead homie," to the other players. And Isaiah walks over. And you think at first that Isaiah is disappointed in Cam and like upset. And he comes over and looks down at the other player. But Isaiah just smiles while Cam is trying to apologize and says, "There he is," and hugs Cam. And he says, "I'm effing proud of you." And so after this, everyone gathers around the player who's down and they're clapping and they're saying what are they saying? All the saviors say, "Amen, amen." That's what they're singing. And so it's a very weird scene because this is almost like a mini ritual in a way because as I said, you see the player that's laying on the ground, obviously tore up. Other players are around, they're clapping, they're singing, stomping their feet, almost celebrating that Cam's innocence. It's almost like his innocence at this point has been taken away because he hurt somebody like that. Because previously in the film, Cam was almost giving, not goody two shoes, but he was just a good guy who was playing the game for his dad, and that was it. But now we're kind of seeing, him make that switch and Isaiah's influence on him starting to take hold. So day 3 is also actually a pretty long chapter because after this singing segment goes on, we see Cam walking down an empty hallway within Isaiah's home, and he can hear the faint noise of a crowd yelling coming from a room. And we assume that this may be the room that Isaiah is watching footage in whenever he says that, he has to go somewhere to do so. And so while Cam is leaning his head against the door to hear what's going on inside the room, we can hear a camera noise go off. After Cam hears this, he starts to back up a little bit, and he backs up in front of 2 pitch black rooms with the doors open. And as he's backing up, we see a football stumble down the hallway. And as Cam is watching this football, we hear kind of that camera gear up noise. And as Cam is looking into one of the dark rooms, he has his back towards the other. And as this camera gear up noise is happening, we can see that figure that injured him on the football field previously starting to appear behind him. And all of a sudden we see cameras flash and paparazzi appear out of nowhere and they take pictures of him until they eventually put the cameras down. They're just smiling really weird. And then a figure appears behind him again and puts a bag over his face and is suffocating him. So after this, while he's getting when he's getting suffocated, I'm getting all over the place. While he's being suffocated, there's laughter also being heard. And so I kind of interpreted this as him maybe being suffocated by the lifestyle, maybe being suffocated by the tug between his previous self and the self that he's becoming while being in this training camp with Isaiah. Just anything, it could mean anything, but I thought this was a very cool scene and just another example of paranoia that's shown throughout the film. And so after this whole scene, Cam sneaks a call with his brother because it's his mom's birthday that he actually forgot. And he snuck a phone call because when he first arrived, and I forgot to mention this, but when he first arrived at Isaiah's house, Isaiah took his phone so that way way he could focus strictly on football and the process that, he was going to put him through that week. And so they're talking, and Marco ends up sneaking up on him. While he's sneaking this call, he apologizes, but Marco doesn't really care. And Marco, sounds a little bit drunk and tells Cam, I'm killing myself for this job. Um, I can't see my family. And this is another kind of funny scene because Cam is like, oh, you have kids? How many kids do you have? And Marco is like, well, I don't have any kids, but if I did have kids, I would be able to see them. And it's just like, well, you're not wrong, King. You're not wrong. And then he goes on to, Marco keeps dropping these weird little lines, and he's just like, it's a shame you're so talented and how well I've prepared you. And Cam is just like, what are you hinting at, man? Like, what are you trying to say? And so Marco ends up walking off, leaves Cam with that final little remark that he made. And we pan out the window, and we can see Marjorie, the president of the fan club, standing out in the rain, snotty-nosed and crying. And she has two other people beside her as well. And so while we jump to Cam and Isaiah in a sauna, and Cam asks Isaiah what it's like being the GOAT, and Isaiah goes into discussing that he has a fear of retiring because he has a nightmare of being on a dirty couch, watching TV and seeing somebody do the job that he knows that he's good at. And so we're kind of getting a look into his mindset over the fact that his contract is soon to be up, and kind of his mindset regarding his career and his view of his view of Cam. And while they're in the sauna, he also says that he'll miss the game, the camaraderie, the smell of the locker room because it smells like brotherhood. And I do not agree with that, but to each their own. And he also tells Cam before he leaves, he says, find your own way to greatness and don't be me, be better. So Cam kind of asks him what he means, but he goes into this other analogy that kind of reminds me of his discussion of the Native Americans and the white football players that whenever he was talking to Cam when he first arrived, because he starts saying, when Cam asks him what he means by do better than me, Isaiah says, if you're a prisoner and they ask you, would you rather have freedom or food? Do you really have an option? And Isaiah kind of just leaves him with that. And when I watched this movie the first time, I didn't understand it, and Imma be real, when I watched it the second time, I still didn't understand it. That's definitely another line I'm gonna have to go back and look into because I really wanna understand what he meant and understand what that analogy was, but I will say him talking about Cam needing to find his own greatness, I think that he was trying to, in a way, tell Cam to leave so that way he doesn't have to go through with the process that they're gearing up for at the climax, because he wants to play football. He doesn't want to leave it. He doesn't want to give up the GOAT, and he doesn't want to give up that position and that adrenaline that he gets from the game. He doesn't want to give that up. So I'm thinking that him telling him to find his own path is him saying, don't take the GOAT from me. And we're going to find out what the GOAT is here in just a little bit. And so Cam or Isaiah ends up leaving the sauna and leaving Cam with his thoughts. And as Cam ends up laying down on the bench in the sauna, we see Marjorie coming out from under the seats. Now, mind you, it's pitch black under there. And so she emerges from the shadows, didn't even see her when Cam laid down. And so she has a rock in her hand, and we see her raise it in order to bring it down on Cam's head to kill him. But he ends up waking up or opening his eyes, and he starts to strangle her without hesitation. And this is another scene, like I was saying with the head smashing one, where you can kind of see Cam's innocence being taken away or being pushed to the side, and Isaiah's training or mentoring taking over that innocence that he had before whenever he first arrived. And so this is kind of a weird scene because whenever Cam strangles Marjorie, at first you think she's dead. And so Cam turns around to the sauna door, and Isaiah's standing there looking, his brows are furrowed, and he looks a little bit disappointed, but he's just kind of there. And so Marjorie ends up getting up and is still alive and tries to attack Cam again, but Isaiah ends up grabbing her throat, and Marjorie asks Isaiah to F her, um, okay, no, Isaiah doesn't grab Marjorie when she runs up to Cam. They close her behind the door. So she is licking the door while asking Isaiah to F her. And so Isaiah is looking quite confused at first, but then he ends up opening the door and kissing her briefly. But then he pulls away from her and he pushes her to the wall and she hits her head and she dies. And so after she does this, Isaiah ends up celebrating killing her and is basically saying that Marjorie knows what it takes to win and she was doing what she needed to do to win and that's what he appreciates. And then he says that this strange line where he says he died for us, so I played for him. And Isaiah's definitely looking very confused. Cam is looking very confused and is, telling Isaiah he's sorry and is trying to figure out what to do. But Isaiah tells him, I got this, I'm gonna clean up. I owe it to the fans. And so he definitely recognizes the idealization that the fans have for him, Isaiah does, and that he sees that people see him as the GOAT, and he sees that he has that GOAT power, which is why he appreciates the fans and says that he owes it to them, because this is his people, this is his following. And like I said, this will all be explained and come full circle once we get to this climax. I know I keep saying that, but it's quite literally because everything that I say, I don't want it to come off as confusing. I want you guys to follow me as I explain all this stuff. And so after Isaiah is left with Marjorie and her two henchmen that came with her, Cam ends up going to Elsie. And Elsie is, calming him down and saying that this is just everyday life for us. And she ends up inviting Cam to party with her and her girlfriends. And during this little party scene, it looks like it's in the same area where he had his ice bath, maybe. But during this scene, a voicemail of his mom is playing over it, which kind of plays again into that battle between innocence and evil with Cam and his mindset. And so after this, we go into chapter 4, which is resilience. And this chapter starts out with Cam waking up, obviously hungover, and Isaiah is sitting in front of him with a gun, asking if Cam had sex with Elsie. And so during this scene, Isaiah is talking about sleeping with Elsie, and he's talking about getting a blowjob. And it's this really weird scene that really took me aback. It didn't take me out the film, but it just made me laugh and just made me forget that this was even a horror film, because Marlon Wayans spits on the gun, and when I tell you he starts slobbing that thing up with his mouth, like he spits on it and starts slobbing it up. And this scene lasts for a minute. I want to say a good maybe 5 seconds of him doing this. And Cam is just sitting there like, WTF am I even doing right now? And then Isaiah ends up telling him, because after Isaiah asks Cam, did you sleep with Elsie? Cam basically says like, no, I have a girlfriend. And, Isaiah's like, oh, you guys college sweethearts or whatever, da, da, da. And Cam's like, no, we actually met in high school. And Isaiah's like, oh, so y'all niggas going steady. And so it's just like, it's just giving drunk uncle and nephew vibes. And Isaiah basically has I'ma hold your hand when I say this moment with Cam, and tells him that if he's not ready or willing to cheat on his girlfriend, then he's not ready to be in his position and take his role as QB for the Saviors. And after this, he tells Isaiah, whatever, let's blow that off. How about today we just hang out and chill like boys? And they go out shooting targets in the desert. And so when we jump to the scene of them being in the desert and at this little shooting range or whatever, makeshift shooting range, Cam mentions being bothered by the fan's death, Marjorie's death. And Isaiah states that he doesn't know who he's talking about. And so as Isaiah remembers who Marjorie is, there's a music stroke, and it's kind of like a doo-doo-doo, as Isaiah says, oh, that woman, like I know who you're talking about. And so, they end up discussing that for a little bit. And while they're talking, we see I believe it was Marco and somebody else bringing a target out for Cam to shoot. And it appears to be a real person because it's a person in mascot uniform, but it's kind of slumped over like a human would be as if they're sleeping. And my boyfriend speculated that this might be Marjorie who's in the costume. And so once we see this person get put out, Isaiah tells Cam that he'll make him a bet. And he says that if he makes the shot of this target, then he will buy Cam whatever he wants, whether that's a house, a car, chicks, whatever he wants, he'll buy it. And he says, but if Cam misses, he's gonna take his innocence. Like, quite literally says, I'm gonna take your youth. And so Cam pauses for a minute, but then laughs it off and it's kind of just like, no, it's okay. I want to work for what I have. And he says, but I'll give you this. If I miss, I might just let you keep QB1 next year. And so Isaiah looks at him kind of funny because he doesn't seem too amused by Cam's proposition. He actually looks a little bit pissed off that he says this, but Cam just kind of smirks and, takes his shot with the target. And he ends up shooting. And after Cam makes this proposition, Isaiah looks over at the target that he's about to shoot. And we just faintly see the target breathe in faintly and breathe out. And then Isaiah looks back at Cam. Cam takes the shot, hits the target falls over, and we hear a music beat drop. And we jump to a scene where we see that Cam is now injecting himself. And so now that I also interpreted this scene as Cam's innocence being fully taken away at this point because he did the killing. Because typically, especially when you hear this next little monologue that Marlon has in this next scene, in this next chapter, I interpreted this scene as Cam getting his innocence taken away because typically in movies or in stories, you see or hear about fathers taking their sons somewhere to kill or to view killings or to perform some type of act of violence to erase the boyhood and introduce the manhood. And so I definitely was thinking of that as I was watching that scene. And so after that, we go to chapter 5, which is Vision. And during this chapter, Cam is doing a bunch of promo work. He's doing photo shoots, interviews. And during this time, Isaiah starts telling a story of fathers taking their sons to the woods to make them men. But he makes an interesting point and says now, instead of dragging them, because he says that fathers used to drag their sons to the woods, but he says now instead of being dragged, they're being drafted. And now the gods that they're trying to please whenever they would take their sons to the woods are the men that are sitting in the skyboxes during the football games. And so after this little over audio of Isaiah giving this monologue of the hunting, Cam is telling a story about how his father and him got into an argument and he said that he didn't want to do football anymore. And 4 days later, his father ended up passing away. So Cam, after he says that his dad died, he says he died for us, so I played for him. And mind you, this is the same line that Isaiah mentions in the sauna scene after he kills Marjorie. So it makes you wonder, what exactly is this him that both are talking about? Is Cam talking about the same him as Isaiah, or is Isaiah talking about the same him as Cam? Which of course obviously is the title of the movie as well. And so after Cam makes this line and this declaration, there's a shot of Cam with these photographers and stylists and stuff in a Last Supper shot at a table. And so in my mind, this was Cam's last day of normalness or being normal and of not being the GOAT, which is what we'll see here in the next chapter coming up. And so after Cam does all this promo stuff, Elsie invites him to a party. But before she invites him, she has a brief talk with him while he's lifting weights in his suit. And she tells him, you can't play football for your dad, or you can't make this sacrifice for your dad. And she says, and if you can't, basically saying, if you can't understand that, then I don't think you're ready. And Cam was like, no, I'm ready. I can do this. And so then, of course, she ends up inviting him to this party. And Isaiah says, I'm going to stay back and watch some footage. Y'all go ahead and go to the party. And so Elsie and Cam end up making a drive, and they end up arriving to what looks to be an abandoned rec center. And so Cam's obviously skeptical. He's like, why are we here? What's this location? And Elsie basically is saying, the men in charge, the owners, want their ritual to be discreet. And so while they're walking in, Cam, asks Elsie what she meant by ritual. And she's like, oh, just party, And it's just like, no, you don't mean just party, man. What do you mean by ritual exactly? I'm confused. I'm skeptical. And so once Elsie and Cam officially walk into the party, Marco comes up to Cam and he also has another line delivery that I thought was very interesting and intriguing. He has this cup of wine and he says to Cam, and Jesus said after a sip of wine, it is finished. Jesus said that. And Cam is just like, okay. And then Marco kind of leans Cam towards him and says, run, very quietly in his ear. And so Cam kind of looks at him kind of strangely and, continues walking forward. And you can see Elsie give Marco like a, WTF are you doing kind of look. And Marco just shrugs. And we continue on with Cam making his way to the owners. And so once Cam makes it to the owners, his manager Tom is also sitting there. And then they also mention the director of Sports Illustrated being there. And so Cam is made to drink some quote unquote wine. And as soon as he drinks the wine, Isaiah, who is he's in like a recliner type chair, he pops up a little bit and his eyes open. And you can tell that he's physically affected by Cam drinking this wine. And so all the owners, Tom, the manager, and the director of Sports Illustrated watch as Cam drinks this wine, and he accepts a chain, which is put around his neck, a diamond chain, and then he also accepts the offer that they have given him to be quarterback for the Saviors. And so after this, Cam he's fully engulfed in the party at this point. He's drinking, he's dancing. And while we see him partying, we cut to scenes of Elsie stabbing something, but we don't quite see what it is. But then eventually we see Cam wandering off into a plastic covered room. And in this room, he sees a helmet that has horns on it. And when he lifts his helmet, he sees Marco's head. And at that point, Elsie walks in and is like, are you sure you're okay? And Cam ends up passing out. Um, and so now after Cam passes out, this is what brings us to chapter 6, which is actually the final chapter titled Sacrifice. And I don't know if I mentioned day 5 or chapter 5's chapter, but the chapter was called Vision. Excuse me if I didn't mention that before. But for chapter 6, Sacrifice, it opens up with Cam in a ice bath again, and we hear like a really chaotic beat drop. It kind of reminds me of that meme of Timbaland and I believe it's Pharrell or Jay-Z in the studio. And it's that scene of them making that really wonky beat. That's what it reminds me of. It's not as chaotic as that, but that's definitely what it reminded me of. And so we see him in this ice bath and he's getting a blood transfusion like we saw Isaiah getting earlier. And so he ends up falling out of the bath and he injects himself with the serum that Marco had been giving him previously, which basically makes him go OP. We see scenes of his body basically not regenerating, but just leveling up and just getting repowered. And it's basically like a shot of adrenaline for him. At this point, Cam is moving like a beast, and it kind of reminds me of James McAvoy, I believe is the actor's name, in Split, that personality movie, because he also had like a beast-like character, a humanly beast-like character in that movie, and that's basically how Cam is moving now. And so he finds one of Isaiah's trophies in the hall as he's walking through Isaiah's home, and he ends up taking it. And he continues walking down the hall until he arrives at the room where Isaiah watches the quote unquote footage. And as he enters, he can see that Isaiah is reclined in this almost therapist type chair, like the chairs that you sit in during therapy sessions. And he's looking up at a spherical screen, or a dome-like screen, which is just showing nothing but scenes of screaming fans cheering for Isaiah. And so the room is also fully red, and in a way, the screen, it is a dome, but it almost kind of looks like an eye, like he may have had, like some metaverse AI eye contacts on that recorded, whatever he was saying throughout the day. That's kind of what it looked like to me. And so while Isaiah is kind of engulfed in this footage and is smiling up at the screen, Cam goes to kill him with the trophy that he found, but Isaiah is able to dodge it. And he goes into this rant about how Cam has him's blood in him, which is Isaiah's mentor and his mentor's mentor. And basically this blood uh, is considered a gift from the gods and has been passed around since the beginning of the football league. However, there can only be one goat or one person to ingest the blood to gain the powers of the goat or him. And so Isaiah says that his contract is in fact going to be up at the end of the season, but since both him and Cam have the blood of him inside of them, it's basically fair ball as to who can win this match that they're about to go up into to see who actually can be the GOAT and who can move forward to be the QB1 for the next season. Um, And so while Isaiah is explaining this, I can't talk. While Isaiah is explaining this, Cam basically says, "You didn't earn it. I actually worked for the spot that I'm at." And Isaiah starts screaming. His voice gets distorted. And he's basically screaming, and he's also becoming beast-like and saying, "I'm him. I'm the GOAT." And while he's ranting and getting, hyped up, Cam starts staring at him with a slight smile, and then we see the fight begin. It's a pretty brutal fight. We see Isaiah slamming Cam's head against the wall, and he starts to press his eyes into his head. But Cam does eventually break away from that. But Isaiah does get the upper hand again and has Cam on the floor. And while on the floor, he ends up breaking Cam's arm. But after Cam gets up after getting his arm broken, Cam asks Isaiah, "What's the opposite of a savior?" And he asks him this as he's grabbing a helmet to use as a weapon. And Isaiah says, "A killer?" questioningly. And Cam says, "A mascot," which is a callback to the earlier conversation they had when he first arrived, where Marlon said, "Don't be a mascot." And so I still don't necessarily understand. I do kind of understand, but I also don't really understand what that initial conversation was at the beginning. But I do understand the connection of what Cam is saying to what Isaiah said at the beginning, though. So I just want to point that out. As he says this, he ends up killing Isaiah with the helmet and with his fists. And as he's killing him, the room is shaking and the crowd is still cheering in the background. Um, and an X-ray shot of Isaiah is shown. So we don't see a full shot of what the aftermath is of what Cam did to him. But we do see an X-ray shot of him looking, pretty tore up, and he is obviously dead. So obviously Cam is the one who won this battle. And so as the crowd is still cheering, Cam ends up leaving the room through some drapes into a sun-filled football field. And there's like a ritual being chanted, or like a ritual chant being said as Cam is walking out into the field. And we can see that it is Elsie, Tom, the Savior's owner, and other businessmen sitting around at this football field. And these are obviously the ones that are facilitating the GOAT slash him that Isaiah and Cam were working so hard for. And it appears that Elsie is the one that facilitates signing the contract and sealing the deal with the devil slash him slash the GOAT. And so Cam ends up listening. So he's obviously taken aback seeing everybody up there, and they're asking him to sign the contract, but Cam is hesitant. He's not doing it. He's not moving forward or doing anything to do it. And so the owner, or it's either the owner or Tom, I believe it's Tom, who was kind of trying to speak to Cam, and he's like, "Your dad sacrificed everything for this man. Why don't you just, go ahead and, sign the contract?" And while he's saying this, we see the camera pan down to a picture of young Cam, his dad, and the Savior's owner. And so at this point, this is where we get the big reveal that all of this was set up by the Savior's owner, by Tom, the devil, him, the GOAT. All this background stuff was happening on purpose to get Cam to sign this contract and take over the GOAT's position. And so not only is he saying that your dad sacrificed everything, that also points out why there was an altar in the family's home. So the family was actively participating in getting Cam prepared and making those sacrifices and participating in those rituals to get him in that position to be drafted to the league and to be the GOAT. So Cam ends up saying, F you, F you, F you, F you to everybody who's, on the ritual team panel. And the football owner, the Savior's owner, ends up standing up and is like, "Hey, like, you need to show some respect because you wouldn't even be in this position if it wasn't for us. We groomed you." He said, "We planned the attack to draft you." And he was like, "I'll kill your family." And so again, this is solidifying the fact that all these people, there was so many hands playing a role in Cam's life from childhood to get him to take on this GOAT role. And that just shows how deeply rooted it is, not only in the league, but in these other people's lives. And so I thought this was such an interesting aspect of the film because I did expect sort of a deal with the devil type vibe towards the end. However, I didn't really expect everybody to be in on it. And during this scene, we also get revealed that Malik, Isaiah's right-hand man, was actually the horned figure that attacked Cam on the field that day. And so Malik, in the figure costume, walks over to Cam, and Cam ends up taking the tool that was used to attack him and kills Malik. And so when he starts to kill Malik, the owners and Tom and Elsie are basically just like, oh my gosh, like, we need to get him to sign the contract. So Elsie tries to, start walking over. She starts walking over to Cam to get him to calm down and sign the contract. But she ends up tripping and falling in a kind of a funny scene. And she ends up stabbing herself in the neck. So she dies. And then Cam goes on to kill the businessman. He kills the owner. He kills Tom. No, he doesn't kill Tom, actually. But as he's killing the businessmen and everything, there's a cheer team and a band performing, and Cam goes to kill Tom, but ends up stopping because he looks back and sees that the devil is basically coming to collect because obviously the Savior's owner and Tom and Elsie, they couldn't produce a goat, a person to fill the goat position to complete the ritual. And so Cam leaves Tom to be killed by the devil. And so Tom is pulled onto this star, this ritual star that Cam was previously standing on whenever they were asking him to sign the contract. And as Cam is walking away from Tom, we hear Tom screaming and we hear Cam say, "No guts, no glory," of course, going back to the initial theme of the movie. And we see planes fly over the film or over the field like they usually do before football games. And the film ends as Cam walks away covered in blood with the weapon over his shoulder. And so that is the end of him and the entire movie. I honestly, I love this movie. I think when I initially watched it, I wanna say I might have gave it a 7.5 out of 10, but upon my second watch, I definitely give it a solid 8 out of 10. I love the atmosphere of the movie. I love the cinematography. I love the pacing because the movie isn't that long. I wanna say it's only about an hour and a half or hour and maybe 40 minutes, and it's not one of those movies where especially with movies that include chapters, it doesn't make you think, "Okay, like, when are we gonna go to the next chapter?" Or, "Okay, like, when's the next thing?" If anything, it makes you question that because you're curious about what else Isaiah's gonna put Cam through or what else is Cam going to experience before, whatever happens, happens. That's the only thing that kind of makes you kind of anticipate what's gonna happen next throughout the movie is that. And I really enjoyed the bounce and the balance between being a Nike type commercial and being a horror film or a thriller film because there's so many scenes, especially in the training facility scenes, where it definitely gives Olympic marketing or Nike campaign or Adidas campaign. I just love that mix because honestly, I've never seen anything like that before. And I thought that was really, really good. And I love the connection of all the little Easter eggs throughout the film, such as Malik being the one that attacked Cam initially, or Cam's dad having a hand in this whole GOAT process from the very beginning. Yeah, just the little Easter eggs you see, or Marco saying, "I prepared you well," giving him a little hints about him being ready to take on that him role and that persona. I thought that was just so cool. And I think the only complaints I have about the movie, which aren't even necessarily complaints, they're more so suggestions or just curiosities. I wish I could have seen what Cam does with this GOAT role now that he's moved on, because it makes me wonder, so is he gonna have more evil tendencies since he took on the GOAT role, or is he going to do what Isaiah suggested, and is he going to be a better him, be better than he was, and is he going to use the GOAT role for good and actually use it to inspire those to go about chasing their dreams for the better and not for the sacrifice of your family or the sacrifice of your purity or the sacrifice of your sanity, your beliefs, your ideologies, and things like that. And I really feel like this movie, while it does have I know a lot of people I talked to about the movie who haven't necessarily seen it, a lot of them were worried about the demonic presence within the movie. But to me, there is that deal with the devil background, but it didn't necessarily give like Conjuring demonic or The Witch demonic or anything like that. And it didn't necessarily show any images of demons. All the images of demons were more so football themed. So it wasn't I didn't really feel that demonic presence really throughout the film. However, there is one there, so I don't want anyone to feel like if you're, against those things or scared to watch anything like that, there is that theme and that motivation and that evilness in there, but it's not you're not gonna see a demon, like, walking around with horns and goat's feet or anything like that. You're not gonna see anything like that in the film, and I really believe that the overall message of the film, not only is it no guts, no glory, but I also think it's Isaiah asking, "What are you willing to sacrifice?" Because there's so many things, even outside of the NFL, when you think about, you know, being an entrepreneur, like, if you have to sacrifice, money, sacrifice finances, or if you work a 9 to 5, maybe you have to sacrifice spending time with your family because, you have to make the money and stuff like that, or I don't know, it just kinda made me think about sacrificing in general and what we're willing to give up and sacrifice to reach our goals. But I also think the movie does a good job at highlighting that you don't have to give up your beliefs or change yourself or go against what you think is right or taking the easy route or anything like that. Like I don't know. I just think it does a good job at focusing on sacrifices, and it's just obviously talking about football specifically, but I think it really does highlight what we're willing to do to get to where we're trying to go, especially when it comes to getting money, being famous. And I just thought it was a very beautiful film. I thought the cinematography was great. I would love to see what else Jordan Tipping does in the future. And I would also love to see what else Tyreek Withers does in future roles as well, because I definitely think this was a good introduction to him being on the big screen. And I also hope that this opens more roles for Marlon Wayans to do more serious roles, because I know that he could get the opportunity. He's a very well-known actor, and I know he has some good clout and good pull within the industry, but I really hope that more roles open up for him to be in serious roles, because I would love to see that. And like I said, this movie is definitely, I 10 out of 10 recommend you to watch it. And I would love to hear you all's thoughts about it. But this does conclude my review and episode 2 for entitled Scares. I hope that you guys enjoyed listening to this just as much as I enjoyed recording and talking about this movie. If you guys do end up watching or have any comments or suggestions or just any tidbits you want to point out to me about this film, please feel free to DM me on all my social media platforms at Entitled Scares. You can find me on Instagram, Spotify, TikTok, and YouTube. You can tell me what you thought about this episode and just any feedback you may have in general. I do plan on putting out episode 3, which I believe will be for weapons, here in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So please be on the lookout for any updates regarding that. But until then, I will see you guys next time. And remember, everyone's entitled to one good scare.